Hello lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm bringing you all of the books that I read in the month of May. So I have 9 books to talk about and then 1 DNF and we're going to jump straight in. The first book I finished on audiobook was Wild Seed by Octavia E. Butler, which was on my classics TBR for this year. Octavia E. Butler is a really big name in sort of black classical writing. She sort of is known for Afrofuturism. She was writing I think in like the 50s-ish, and this is book 1 of the Patent Master series, and it basically follows 2 supernatural beings who end up meeting each other and then sort of their interaction over years. One of them is sort of this kind of god type person who can basically inhabit different bodies but burns through those bodies, and in doing so needs to find another host and always kills the host that they end up taking on. The other one is a woman who can shapeshift and basically both heal herself but also other people, and it's about the god type character who is trying to collect and then interbreed people who have mysterious powers. So he's trying to almost like create a kind of super race. It's got a lot of kind of X-Men undertones. There's a lot of conversations about race because it's taking part, it's the main thing I think is in the 1700s or sort of basically historically, and there's conversations about race and enslavement and him trying to save her from possible enslavement, but in doing so also limiting her freedoms, and it's about kind of the tension between the two of them. Like I say, it is book 1. There are I think either 4 or 5 books in the series. It has a bit of like a controversial publication history. There is one book that Octavia E. Butler has actually like shunned and after publication said that she wished she'd never published it, and it's one of these series that like the publication order and the reading order vary depending on who you ask. So I'm reading it just in the way that Goodreads says, which is basically chronologically from the point of view of the book rather than from the order of publication. So I believe this one is like almost like a prequel, and it did feel kind of prequel-y in a way that I almost wish I'd done more research before starting it and realised that there was these like different options for reading order, because I believe the next book takes it far more into modern day and is about the clashes between these 2 great or basically functionally immortal people. It was interesting and I'm excited to see where the series goes, but in itself as a self-contained story I found it a little bit lackluster. The next book I finished is A Botanical Daughter by Noah Medlock. Both of these books were books I was reading for Springathon, which was the nature writing readathon that was at the beginning half of the month, although I kind of just allowed my reading to drift over towards the end of the month as well, and I think this was my pick for summer. This is a horror fantasy book, I guess, and it is a retelling of Frankenstein, and it has a hell of a lot of LGBTQIA representation. We've got a gay romance and a lesbian romance in it as well. Really good fun in that way. So it is about 2 mad scientists who have this relationship together. One of them is a taxidermist, the other one is a botanist, and the botanist basically tries to create life. He finds this weird mycelium and he puts it in a corpse that they dig up, which is actually the girlfriend of their housekeeper, or most recent housekeeper, and it's about sort of, there's a little bit of a murder mystery thing going on there as well, and it's about sort of this like budding relationship between them and this kind of desire to build a family and sort of the absurdity and like grotesque beauty of this weird plant creature woman. It was really good fun. It had an incredibly strange sex scene at the end where it talks about her going down on the plant person and the taste of moss. Very weird. Was less into that part of it, but generally I thought it was fun and interesting and a cool take on Frankenstein, and I did really like the writing. It was very lush and vivid, and there was sort of this slightly fantastical element to it. Everything was a little bit absurd and kind of dialed up, and even though I've not actually seen or read the book, it did kind of remind me of the new sort of Frankenstein-esque type thing with Emma Stone in it. It sort of had similar-ish vibes from what I can see with how that's been described in the media. So yeah, really fun read and would totally recommend if you're into mushrooms. And apparently this is becoming a new subgenre of horror that I need to check out, which is called Spora, which is basically like spore horror, and this is definitely a great example of it, and I'm really intrigued to check out more in that subgenre. The next book I finished is The Sakura Obsession, The Incredible Story of the Plant Hunter Who Saved Japan's Japanese Blossoms by Naoko Abe. This was the group book for Springathon, and it is a non-fiction looking at
Collingwood Cherry Ingram, Cherry is his nickname, which was a guy in the like turn of the century, 19th to 20th century, who basically was trying to rescue Japan's cherry blossoms because they were going through this very homogenizing moment in terms of like plant evolution, and the way that they were breeding was very much narrowing the cherry blossom species, and he had been collecting his own cherry blossoms and then in doing so brought a load of them back to Japan. This book was really cool and interesting, less so about Collingwood personally for me, but more about like the history of Japan and the relationships between the UK and Japan historically over the years, because it was something that, it's that kind of classic thing of like, you don't know what you don't know, and I didn't realise until reading this book that my like knowledge of Japan was shockingly bad. Like it really was just like samurai, Pearl Harbor, Hello Kitty, and like nothing else in between, which is so ignorant of me and unbelievable that I hadn't clocked that this was something that I was like missing. So it was really, really interesting to find out more about the history of Japan, the history of Britain's relationship with Japan, and sort of Japan's relationships with the world as a whole, and the way that their kind of culture has changed, and the way that the cherry blossom as a like motif and important icon within Japanese culture has shifted over the years and gone from something very positive to incredibly negative. This idea of through the Second World War of it being sort of warped to become this image of cherry blossoms falling, petals falling, that it was an honour to give your life rather than being seen as a celebration of life historically beforehand. So really cool, interesting book from that perspective. I was less bothered about Collingwood and sort of his life as a whole. That felt a little bit just sort of, you know, typical like privileged white guy who like natural scientist who just sort of like fumbles around doing the thing, and like he was very good with both insects and plants, fair cop to him, he did a lot of work in that area, but it just felt a little bit like a story that we've read a bunch of times before. So less bothered by him, but pleased I read the book as a whole, and just, yeah, interesting vibes all around. So a book that I've had this a few times with a couple of non-fictions recently, where there is one person whose name is in the title, like the Etta Lemon book I read about the woman who started the RSPCB, but actually it turns out that the book has got way more detail and goes into way more information and is much broader, and that's the bit that's often more interesting. So I kind of wish that these were like rebranded and remarketed a little bit more to more accurately reflect the depth of knowledge that you're going to get from the book. The next book I finished is Cities and Canopies, Trees in Indian Cities by Harini Nagendra. This one I listened to on audiobook because it was basically the easiest way to get a hold of it, because this is on my Around the World in 12 non-fiction books, and it's one of those ones that I didn't check the availability before I put it on a TBR, and it turns out it's a fucking nightmare to get a hold of in the UK. So I listened to it on audiobook, and I kind of wish I hadn't. It is a non-fiction collection of like vignettes about various different trees that are important to India in a variety of different ways, and kind of a conversation about sort of India's place within the world, and again like how it's interacted with other countries, and sort of what counts as native and what no longer counts as native. But I did find this book really hard going. I don't know exactly what it was about it. I don't think the audiobook format worked particularly well for me. I found a lot of the like pattern recognition of words really difficult. The narrator, who I believe was the author, has a very strong Indian accent that for me meant that it was quite difficult to pick up on scientific terms that I am more familiar with when written down. So that was something that I think if I'd swapped to a written form I would have enjoyed this book more. But the written form was like 20 quid on Kindle, something ridiculous, and I just really wasn't willing to spend that much money on a book that I was already not particularly enjoying. And there were parts that kind of resonated with me, but it felt like each vignette was very short and it just kind of was a bit lackluster for me. But I did learn a lot more about India, and that was kind of the point. And again, these things are like jumping off points to try and find other books and other things that I want to learn about. And it was kind of cool to learn about sort of, you know, to think about trees in connection with cities a bit more and kind of urbanisation. So there was some interesting stuff in there like urban planning and things like that, but I think format wise it was a bit lackluster for me. I'm using the word lackluster repeatedly, aren't I, in this video. Then we had a complete departure from all other things that I read, and that was Stolen by Presley Hall. This is a sci-fi romance, and it's book 2 in a series, and it was distinctly mediocre. It is about, I missed like book 1, so I didn't really get most of the world building, which was really apparent when about 2/3 through the book the heroine mentioned that the alien dude that she was into had horns, and it hadn't come up before now. maybe I was skim reading, but like I could have sworn he was just like a normal looking dude, because all aliens are very humanoid despite the ridiculous variation we have in species on our planet. Miraculously, the aliens we want to bang in our fantasy sci-fi romance books all look fairly humanoid. But yeah, this dude had horns. I was very surprised. So yes, the world building was a little bit meh. Basically, the bunch of women either get sold from Earth or kidnapped, and then these guys rescue them, but then they crash land or they run out of resources, so they're on a different planet, and the guys are having to like fight to raise money in like fighting pits, gladiator style, to get off the planet, and she hijacks a ship because she just wants to go back to Earth, whereas all the other chicks are totally down just banging some alien dudes and going back to their planet. So she tries to go back to Earth, he follows her, and then it's all a bit, do you see, it didn't really work for me. The vibes weren't there. It was fun, but I really don't think it's a particularly strong example of a sci-fi romance. Like, it felt very riffing off of Ice Planet Barbarians, and I don't know which book series came first, but yeah. And like, what do you mean they have horns? I really feel like maybe it was on me as a reader. Maybe I didn't need to read book one, but for me, a landmark part of romance is like, you don't have to jump in at the very beginning. It's kind of on the author to make sure that you know what's going on. So yeah, meh. The next book I finished is Life Changing by Helen Pilcher, and this was freaking wicked. This was on my 5-star predictions for non-fiction, and I freaking nailed it. This was an amazing read. This is a look at how humans are altering life on Earth. It started with the history of domestication, and there were a few points at the beginning where I was like, oh, this is a little bit simplistic. We've been here before. We all know about the Siberian foxes. You domesticate them and their ears go droopy. But it was one that, after that point, started to go into a load more detail, was really, really interesting. We then started looking at genetic modifications, breeding modifications, and sort of the ways that we have consciously warped and changed life on our planet. But then also the second half of the book was focused more on the way that animals have been responding to human beings and sort of the natural genetic variations that have been occurring because of human intervention, or like human environments without our active intervention, if that makes sense. And then there's a whole bit at the end about like de-extinction and whether that's something that we should be investing in as a species. Sort of, we've done all this damage to the planet, is this something that we can start to undo, and what are the different ways that we can do that beyond sort of just more standard breeding programs. At one point it talks about coral in vitro fertilization. You heard me right there, coral in vitro fertilization. Freaking cool. This is exactly the kind of science book that is right up my alley. There's loads going on about evolution and genetics. It's really easy to get into. She starts off with a really basic description of DNA, going all the way back to like your A and T and your G and C, and like if you're really like, I don't know what you're on about, Emma, this is going to be a lovely intro to science book for you. But then she builds on that and we start to get into a lot more detail about, like, you know, like your CRISPR DNA stuff and the way that they're like slicing things out, and it all gets way more technical. So it has a lovely build up, and it really isn't assuming a certain amount of knowledge. Plus all the anecdotes are freaking cool. This is the kind of one where you're gonna be like texting your mate constantly being like, oh my god, did you know that there are goats that we've genetically engineered so that they like, their milk has spider silk in it? That's not an exaggeration, that is literally in this book. I'm sorry, we did what to what now? Like, it's just so freaking cool, and it's not crazy long as well, which is really nice in a non-fiction book. Don't get me wrong, Ed Young's Immense World being a chunky boy, I enjoyed it, but it was a bit of a slog, whereas this one just felt like time just kind of flew by and we just had a good ride the whole time. So yeah, really solid, and I definitely need to check out more from this author. Then I finished Rosewater Redemption by Tade Thomspon. This is a cool, weird sci-fi Afrofuturism book. This is book 3 of the trilogy. I read book 1 and 2 quite a while ago, and boy did it show. I still really enjoyed this book. I think I gave it about 4 stars on Goodreads by the end, and I do think it tied everything narratively together quite well. It is about a world where some kind of alien presence has been, like, there's been a first encounter type thing in Nigeria, and this species or like crash landed kind of spaceship type thing called wormwood has appeared, and it's a very like fungal based life form that is healing people in the area and also giving people some psychic abilities, and it's about like government control of this and sort of shenanigans ensue from there. That's sort of your basic précis of book 1. Obviously a lot has happened, and I don't want to spoil anything if you are interested in reading book 1. This book had a lot of characters, a lot going on, and for me it suffered because it's been such a long time since I read book 1 and book 2. I did look up the Wikipedia synopsis, but it's not quite the same, so I think I missed some threads in there, and it did get a bit bogged down in the middle where we were just jumping perspective constantly. But by the end of it, I liked how everything wrapped together, and I think I got what was going on, and everything was really cool, and it's just like a really fun, cool world. It's like our planet, but in like 2050, I think, and the alien makes its presence only like 2012 or something like that. So yeah, just a really fun, interesting plant meets sci-fi kind of energy, which again, obviously I read for Springathon, which is why we've got so much plant stuff going on. Then I have 2 books which I literally finished this morning at a time of filming that I was freaking adamant I was going to finish in time for. Technically it is the 1st of June when I'm filming this, but like, fuck it. I read most of them in May and it totally counts, so we're including them in this wrap up now. So the first one is Olivia Waite's The Lady's Guide to Celestial Mechanics. This is actually on my June TBR, but I really enjoyed it. It is a historical romance. It is between 2 lovely ladies. It is a lesbian romance, and basically one of them, her previous lover has just got married to a man. Her father has just died, and she helped him with lots of his astronomy, and she gets this offer from our other heroine, who is a recent widow, to come and help her translate this astronomical text that's only ever been written in French at that point. They have this lovely budding romance. The romance is not a slow burn at all, like they really get into it very freaking fast, and it basically becomes a bit of a conversation about like women being respected within science, but also this lovely subplot of like, what is art and what deserves to be respected, because our widower heroine is like a really amazing embroidery artist but doesn't respect her own craft at all, because it's you know, it's women's frippery, it's sewing, it's not one of these fine arts. So there was this like lovely conversation going on there. There's tons of astronomy stuff in it. The relationship is so freaking cute, and whilst I won't spoil anything, the 3rd act breakup after the obvious immediate, like before the obvious immediate happily ever after, isn't hinging on some nonsensy miscommunication that often happens in these things, and actually felt very genuine, and a lot of like real conflict between these 2 women that they did have to overcome, a lot of emotional growth that needed to occur, and a lot of like societal things that they had to get through. And I liked the way that the whole thing was resolved. It felt very genuine, and like neither one of them had to compromise or give up too much power. So yeah, just generally a lovely read all round. I definitely want to check out more from this author. This is book 1 of a series, but obviously each book follows a different couple, and it kind of had like a Thomas Hardy 2 on a Tower kind of energy. I loved all the astronomy stuff in it. It was freaking wicked. We love women in STEM. And then a book that I've just finished on audiobook is The Whole Picture, The Colonial Story of Art in the Art in Our Museums and Why We Need to Talk About It by Alice Procter. This is basically a look at how museums have managed to get the various items that they have over the years, pretty much always with very terrible colonialist, racist backgrounds, that always like with genocide and terrible things. We all know Britain, and not just Britain, have been shit in the past and now. But also, what is their role within the museum? How are these items displayed? How do we interact with them? And sort of what is the role of the museum or the modern artist now with trying to kind of decolonize these and make space for their original stories rather than just whitewashing it. The book is broken into 4 different sections, which that was sort of the weirdest bit for me. I didn't really understand. Alice like divides the book into 4 separate kind of museum spaces, but I didn't really get the distinction she was making between like the classroom and the palace and like the other things that she was saying. But if you ignore that and just take each individual chapter as we go through, each one focuses on a different piece of art or item, and then looks at the background of that particular piece and then what it says about how we currently interact with art. And that as a structure I thought was really fantastic. So you kind of just need to ignore the overarching bit over the top and just kind of focus on each individual section as we go through. Really great book when it comes to like sparking conversation and discussion. There were times where it felt like Alice was just shooting down every attempt to try and have a dialogue in these areas. There was a lot of stuff about, you know, this artist back in 20 whatever tried to do a piece that looked at museums and did this particular take on it, and this is bad because all it does is it just sort of re-traumatizes people, or like, and things like that, where it felt a little bit like nitpicky and like everything we did was problematic, which can be a kind of common problem in these kinds of books, where it's almost quite easy to do nothing and to follow the status quo when every time an attempt is made to rectify something, all that happens is we critique it for going about it in the wrong way. So that was something which was interesting to kind of read through and be like, well, what exactly do you want from people in these spaces? And Alice, what for you is considered successful? She did give some examples at the end that she did think was successful, and she kind of talked about this book is really here to like promote conversation rather than necessarily have all the answers, because exactly what counts as a way of rectifying it is going to be very different for different people. But it was a lovely like way for me personally interacting with art, because I tend to read art history rather than like art criticism, and so the sort of meta-analysis and really kind of confronting my space within art galleries as a viewer, what kinds of shows do I tend to go to, and sort of how do I interact with these things, was really interesting. And you know, a look at museums as a whole and their like long-running history in the sort of objectification and degradation, I guess, of other people and other cultures. So yeah, a book that has left me with a lot to think about. The only other book I'm going to mention very briefly, just because it was on my Springathon TBR, is Sea Room by Adam Nicholson. I did DNF this, it really just wasn't working for me. This is a nature writing book about Adam inheriting a collection of islands called the Shants, which are like 3 islands up, I believe around Scotland, not confident. And basically I didn't really enjoy this book because like Adam has inherited these islands through, it's almost like connecting to like what the whole picture was talking about, like his family probably should never have had them in the first place. It's definitely like a mark of privilege, and then the way that he interacted with the islands felt very privileged in a lot of places, and it was just sort of a meandering mess of a book that a lot of the time was very dull and was just sort of like relatively privileged white guy being able to commission a boat and then like going off and seeing the islands on his boat, and I just it lacked the kind of love of nature that I was looking for and that sort of self-awareness that I was looking for, and there wasn't really like a purpose to him being there. And then there were a few fun facts and like some archaeological stuff that kind of kept me going at least the halfway point, and I realized I just wasn't enjoying this book and I didn't like its writing style. It felt very messy and self-indulgent in a way that just was not clicking for me. So for me it was like, just get this off your TBR and go focus on something else. So that was a DNF, and I know quite a few people are a fan of Adam Nicholson, so I'm really sorry about that. I believe that's his first book, so maybe he gets better with time, but yeah, he's a no from me. So that is everything that I read in May. Let me know in the comments down below, what did you think? Do you agree with me? And did you have a successful Springathon if you joined in? I managed to read 6 out of the 8 that I, or well, at least try to read, sorry Sea Room, start 6 of the 8 that were originally on my TBR, so I'm really pleased with that. So yeah, that's everything. Have a wonderful reading week and I'll chat to you soon. Bye.